preparing for a series of battles against terrorists.
Help us round up these people.
The president lines up world support and orders warplanes to the Persian Gulf. CBS News learns targets may include Saddam Hussein. The money trail. Did terrorists make millions manipulating markets before the attack? And remembering two brothers, casualties in a new kind of war.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Special extended coverage of America Rising. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. U.S. military forces are on the move tonight to be in position for possible strikes against people and governments linked to terrorism in general and specifically the murderous attacks in New York and Washington. President Bush spent much of this day trying to line up international support and the support of the American people for what he sees as a sustained war against terrorists. It cannot be a war without more American casualties. The president will address a joint session of Congress tomorrow night at 9 Eastern Time. Hear more of today's developments. The president ordered U.S. warplanes and missiles to the Persian Gulf for Operation Infinite Justice. The president met with or telephoned world leaders trying to enlist their help. Mr. Bush again demanded that Afghanistan's Taliban leaders turn over suspected mastermind Osama bin Laden. At ground zero of the terror attacks in New York City, on night 9, it is still officially a search and rescue operation. President Bush says the attacks affected the U.S. economy in a big way. Shocked it, the president said. The latest fallout, American Airlines and United Airlines are cutting a total of 40,000 jobs. Boeing is cutting 30,000. On Wall Street, the post-attack sell-off continues. The Dow plunged more than 400 points before recovering to finish the day with a final loss of 144 for the day. The Nasdaq off 27. At the Pentagon, planning is moving ahead for a war on terror. CBS's David Martin reports tonight some around President Bush believe now that it should include finishing what they see as the unfinished business of the Gulf War. David?
Dan, the first orders have been issued and the military buildup for the war against terrorism is beginning. There is a battle within the Bush administration over who the target should be. Everyone wants to go after Osama bin Laden, but some senior officials see this as a chance to finish off Saddam Hussein.
With security so tight even the sailors were being screened, a battle group headed by the carrier Roosevelt got underway from Norfolk, Virginia this morning and headed east. This was supposed to be a routine deployment, but the new mission was broadcast loud and clear.
Now it is time for us to pick up the mantle, to destroy terrorism and remove this cancer.
The Roosevelt and a Marine Amphibious Task Force, which is scheduled to get underway tomorrow, are only part of the forces the Pentagon is preparing to move into position. B-52 bombers will be sent to the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. More warplanes and reconnaissance aircraft will go to bases in the Persian Gulf. But first, the Air Force must pre-position tanker aircraft in countries along the way to serve as flying gas stations for the combat aircraft. Keeping that so-called air bridge open will almost certainly require more reserve call-ups. And it's just the beginning of a buildup that will also include ground troops, although Pentagon officials refuse to say exactly where all these forces are going.
There are movements, and you will see more movements, and I hope everyone understands, I'm sure the American people understand why we do not want to reveal the details of those movements to people who may be trying to figure out what we're about to do next.
In fact, the administration is still trying to figure out what to do next. One option favored by some senior Pentagon officials calls for targeting not just Osama bin Laden, but Saddam Hussein as well, going all the way to Baghdad and finishing the job President Bush's father started in the Gulf War. Dan?
David Martin at the Pentagon. The hunt goes on for clues, evidence, and suspects in the attack on America. CBS's Jim Stewart has some very interesting late details on the investigation. Jim?
Dan, federal investigators believe that some of the pilots and co-pilots of the 4 hijacked aircraft last week were murdered before the planes crashed. Investigators will not disclose what leads them to that conclusion. FBI technicians have also recovered fragments of conversations within one of the doomed cockpits. Much of it is described, however, as, quote, a jumbled mixture of grunts and screams. Officials say reconstructing details of how the planes were taken over is important not from an evidentiary standpoint, but a preventive one. They confirm, for example, that the bodies of 2 flight attendants from United Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania, were found with their hands bound. And they theorize the pilots from that flight and others may have left their cockpit seats when they saw flight attendants being slashed with box knives. The president suggested just such a scenario earlier this week.
It's barbaric behavior. They slit throats of women on airplanes in order to achieve an objective that is beyond comprehension.
Meanwhile, Attorney General John Ashcroft, who visited the Pentagon today, indicated there's growing evidence another country could have played a role in Tuesday's attack.
It's pretty clear that the networks that conduct these kinds of events are harbored and supported, sustained, protected by a variety of foreign governments.
U.S. officials have already confirmed they believe hijacker Mohammed Atta met with an Iraqi intelligence official in Europe early this year. Atta was seen here on an airport surveillance camera in Portland, Maine, 3 hours before the attacks began. And in other developments, one suspect in particular, Zacarias Moussaoui, is receiving greater attention and could be charged soon. Moussaoui was detained on INS charges in Minnesota before the attacks. He had been undergoing flight training. Finally, officials discount talk that another attack was specifically planned for this weekend, saying that while some suspects, including 2 of the dead hijackers, had booked flights that day, there is no pattern suggesting other attacks are imminent. Dan?
Jim Stewart in Washington. As we mentioned, the president is trying to prepare the American people for what's ahead in the war against terrorism, including casualties. We want to play for you now a considerable amount of what Mr. Bush had to say late this afternoon.
America needs to know that that we in government are on alert, that we recognize life around the White House or around the Congress is not normal, is not the way it used to be, because we're very aware that people have conducted an act of war on our country, and that all of us urge our fellow Americans to go back to work and to work hard. But we must be on alert. The American people are united. They're united in the resolve to help heal the nation, but they're also united in the understanding that we've entered into a new day, and we'll deal with it. America will hold those evildoers accountable. We don't view this as a war of religion in any way, shape, or form. As a matter of fact, Islam preaches peace. The Muslim faith is a peaceful faith. And there are millions of good Americans who practice the Muslim faith, who love their country as much as I love the country, who salute the flag as strongly as I salute the flag. For those who try to pit religion against religion, our great nation will stand up and reject that kind of thought. We won't allow that to creep into the consciousness of the world. We're going to lead the world to fight for freedom, and we'll have Muslim and Jew and Christian side by side with us. Not only have someone conducted an act of war on us, our economy has slowed way down, and this is an emergency. We've had all 3, it seems like to me, and I'm going to work with Congress to send a clear message to America, American workers, American business people, that this government will respond to this emergency. This has shocked our economy, and we're going to respond, and that's exactly what this leadership and I have been talking about.
In Afghanistan tonight, thousands of civilians fearing war with the United States are trying to flee their country. Iran has closed its border with Afghanistan, and now neighboring Pakistan, already burdened with millions of Afghan refugees, will not let them cross the border either. And as CBS's Alan Pizzi reports from near that border, at the Khyber Pass, Pakistan's leader is trying to convince his people that backing the U.S. is the right thing to do.
In a nationally televised address, Pakistan's leader, General Pervez Musharraf, told his people they were joining a fight against terrorism and not against Islam or the people of Afghanistan. The country faced a grave crisis, he said, and siding with America was in Pakistan's best interest. General Musharraf said Washington was asking for use of Pakistan's airspace, information and intelligence, and logistics support. In exchange, the U.S. has promised Pakistan a substantial but unspecified aid package.
You will find that we will stand by our friends who stand by us. We are currently looking at any number of ways to be responsive to Pakistan as they have been responsive to us.
Taliban spiritual leader Mullah Muhammad Omar told clerics who had gathered to debate a holy war on America that talks had been held with U.S. officials and he was prepared for more. But he wanted evidence of Osama bin Laden's involvement in the terror attacks presented to Afghanistan's Supreme Court or judges from 3 Islamic countries. That strikes a chord in Pakistan, where opposition to American troops coming continues to grow. Police today arrested about a dozen demonstrators who shouted jihad, holy war. And yet another Pakistani cleric issued a call to arms for Pakistani Muslims. They must obey any Taliban order for a religious war if the U.S. attacks, he said. Perhaps with that in mind, main routes between Pakistan and Afghanistan, such as this one through the famous Khyber Pass, have been closed to all but a few trucks. This is as close as foreigners are allowed to the Afghan border. The Pakistani army has declared it a sensitive area. Local officials said the border is being reinforced with extra troops and heavy artillery. But this wild frontier extends for nearly 1,000 miles, and there's no way it can be sealed totally. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, near the Pakistan-Afghanistan border.
President Bush talked with congressional leaders late today about how to heal the economic wounds inflicted by the terror attack. There's talk now of some overall economic stimulus package. CBS News business correspondent Anthony Mason has more about the financial fallout.
Thank you very much. Behind closed doors, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan briefed congressional leaders today, but the economic impact of this new war is already out in the open.
Make no mistake about it, this has affected our economy in a big way.
2 major airlines, first American and then United, announced today each will lay off 20,000 workers. Film giant Eastman Kodak also said profits are plummeting and job cuts are coming. And brokerage firm Charles Schwab slashed earnings estimates. All that triggered a dramatic sell-off on Wall Street. By mid-afternoon, the Dow was down more than 400 points. It rallied to erase more than half those losses, but get used to the roller coaster, says Schwab's Marty Cunningham.
I think we have got plenty of volatility and apprehension and anxiety to live through.
90 for 50, 100,000 the figure.
I mean, that I think will be the norm for at least the next month or two.
80, 90, 50 up.
So fasten your seatbelts.
It will be an absolutely bumpy ride.
Mr. Greenspan may try to comfort the markets tomorrow. The Fed chairman will testify before the Senate Banking Committee on Capitol Hill. And an edgy Wall Street will be monitoring his comments more closely than ever. Dan?
Anthony Mason, thanks. Not far from Wall Street, there are now 233 confirmed deaths at Ground Zero. More than 5,400 still missing. The number of wounded is simply not something that can be determined. There's so many of them. And it now appears that the victims among the dead there may include citizens from as many as 50 countries. CBS's Byron Pitts is at the scene tonight. Byron?
Well, Dan, today authorities moved in more heavy equipment as they removed more bodies. The frantic pace of days gone by is over. Heavy machines now do most of the work. Rescue teams have been given medicated gels to place beneath their noses to mask the stench of death. Department chaplains offer last rites over firefighters and police officers as their bodies are pulled from the rubble.
And we know that God is receiving these people in a powerful way.
Now authorities are depending more on the power of technology, satellite images to point out the places still too dangerous to search.
And what we're doing is comparing those pre-disaster photos to what we've got right now, which helps the structural engineers and everybody else to ascertain damage estimates down in the area.
So far, more than 59,000 tons of debris has been removed from the site, carried to a nearby landfill in more than 6,000 truckloads, where investigators will again comb through for evidence of the crime and human remains. In the midst of so much suffering and so much work, there is talk lawmakers in New York are considering ways to extend the mayor's term until this crisis is over. Rudolph Giuliani has led this city, led the rescue teams, like a general leads an army.
There's a kind of anger that you get and determination to do something about it that I can't describe.
And tonight they are still determined to find survivors, even though no one's been found alive in 7 days. Dan?
Byron Pitts. Up next on CBS, Eye on America on the terror trail. Again today, part of the tapestry of America is woven in sorrow and services for the dead. In Colorado, friends and family held a memorial service for 43-year-old Jason Dahl, the pilot of United Flight 93. Passengers on that flight may have tried to retake control from the hijackers before it crashed in Pennsylvania. There are so many memorials, so many funerals, one after another.
Present off!
In Hicksville, New York, services were held for police officer George Howard, murdered at age 45 in the Trade Center attack. Howard was a 16-year veteran of the force. The Red Cross reports a big increase in Americans reaching out for emotional help since the attack. Calls to mental health hotlines are up 30%. Almost half the people in a national survey say they're having trouble concentrating. 1 out of 3 reports trouble sleeping. And then there are the pets. Animal rescue teams have retrieved many near Ground Zero in New York City. They're treating animals for shock and lack of food and water and reuniting them with grateful owners. In another sign of business not as usual, more people are trading the plane for the train. Amtrak reports business has almost doubled. 2,000 more passenger cars added in the Northeast alone. The U.S.-led war on terrorism is getting at least verbal support from some among a one-time adversary, Iran. In Tehran this week, demonstrators held a candlelight vigil for victims of the attacks in New York and Washington, and Iran's foreign minister was quoted today as saying his government wants those behind the attacks, quote, tracked down and severely punished. Where Iran's controlling mullahs stand is unclear. Is hurting, but no sector of the U.S. economy is feeling the pain of the terror attacks more than the airline and aerospace industries. American Airlines and United Airlines today became the latest to announce job cuts, 20,000 apiece. John Blackstone reports this follows word that the aircraft manufacturer Boeing is cutting as many as 30,000.
The men and women who build Boeing airplanes are facing a disturbing prospect. 1 out of every 3 workers could soon be out of a job.
It's uncertain times.
And some who could be laid off can't argue with the reasons.
People are going to be afraid to fly. I mean, I'm afraid to fly. I don't want to go on an airplane again.
With airlines facing bankruptcy, Boeing says it has no choice but to slow its assembly lines to match sharply reduced demand for new planes.
Going from 538 airplanes to 400 airplanes is a tremendous reduction in production capability.
Most of the 20,000 to 30,000 layoffs will be at Boeing's huge aircraft assembly plants in the Seattle area. The loss of that many paychecks will damage both the economy and the psychology of the region, says economist Dick Conway.
So it becomes a cyclical thing. People hear of layoffs, they become worried, causes more layoffs.
That's right. That's right. There is a bit of a tumbling effect that occurs.
Washington's governor, Gary Locke, now sees his state facing a recession he hoped could be avoided.
Well, this is very surprising and very stunning and shocking news for everybody. It really shows how everybody in the United States and people here in the Pacific Northwest are going to be affected.
Boeing has big assembly plants in Wichita and Los Angeles, as well as in the Northwest. Workers seem ready to accept layoffs as a small sacrifice after the tragedy in New York.
And looking at what those people are going through and what they've lost, the fact that I might lose my job is not really that big a deal.
The Boeing workers here have felt a particular pain over the terrorist attacks. They built the aircraft that were turned into weapons and used to kill so many. John Blackstone, CBS News, Seattle.
As layoffs come by the tens of thousands at the nation's airlines, Congress is working on a multi-billion-dollar bailout package for the industry. But as CBS's Bob Schieffer reports now, there are strings attached. Bob, tell us about it.
Well, Dan, it was sort of a message of tough love that Congress sent to the airlines today. Yes, Congress said, we know you're in desperate financial straits. Yes, we're going to give you some help. But we also want some assurances that this money won't be used to finance executive bonuses.
I know you can agree that it's not fair to lay off employees and ask the American people to use taxpayer dollars at a time like this if that money is used for executive compensation.
With most bonuses based on profits, a lineup of airline executives said no one would be getting bonuses and that sacrifice would be shared by workers and executives.
There is going to be a tremendous sacrifice, shared sacrifice, which we believe is appropriate. It will happen, and it will happen big time.
With all the airlines facing bankruptcy because of last week's shutdown, the airlines are pushing for $5 billion in federal aid immediately and more than $12 billion in loan guarantees. As Mullen put it today, they need it now.
It is like Friday. I mean, that is the kind of time frame that we need.
But even with the help, they stress massive layoffs are still likely.
Please, yes or no, if you can. 100,000 layoffs, notwithstanding $20-some-odd billion, if we were to give you your package?
That number could materialize, yes, sir.
Just after the executives left the room that American made that announcement it was laying off 20,000 workers. A few hours later, United made its announcement it would lay off 20,000 too. Now, there's every indication, by the way, that Congress is going to grant this financial aid, but it may hinge on whether some of the airline executives are willing to take pay cuts. Dan?
Bob Schieffer on Capitol Hill. In the complicated battle against terrorism, the Justice Department is seeking new and expanded surveillance powers. This raises some constitutional questions, but the U.S. government has already put into effect new powers to detain without charges some potential suspects. And as CBS's Wyatt Andrews reports, the number of detainees is growing.
The administration is asserting emergency police powers to detain immigrants for any reasonable period without criminal charges. The proclamation from the Attorney General gives the FBI time to question the 115 detainees now in custody.
When circumstances require us to use the full force and effect of the order, we will do so. I make no apology. I make no apology for being forceful.
The FBI hopes to gain leverage over any accomplices of the hijackers who might still be in the country on expired visas. Last week, the FBI held these two men on immigration violations in Texas while gathering the evidence naming the men material witnesses. The administration is also proposing what it calls the Mobilization Against Terrorism Act. Under it, the Attorney General would have powers to, quote, certify that an alien might facilitate terrorism or endanger the national security. That certification could not be reviewed by any court. In fact, habeas corpus protections against unlawful detention would be suspended until the certified suspect faced deportation.
Somehow that person needs to be able to defend against the evidence.
Civil libertarians and immigration lawyers believe it's pushing the Constitution to restrict court review.
What those terrorists last week exactly intended to accomplish was to bring America to its knees. And we need to guard against doing that to ourselves.
The immigration status of the hijackers is also being checked for what that might show about vulnerability. Several of the hijackers' visas had expired, a condition called out of status. Those hijackers were never tracked down because the truth is millions of immigrants might be out of status at any given time. Wyatt Andrews, CBS News, Washington.
Investigators on the trail of some terrorists are focusing even more attention tonight. Same firm at the World Trade Center. They were born 10 years apart, but as CBS's Lee Cowan reports, they died together and were mourned and remembered together.
On a tree-lined, flag-lined street, in a neighborhood like so many others this week, grief has come to pay a visit. And sometimes it visits more than once.
I just want to be there for my sister and her children.
Lynn Stevens has watched her sister say her final goodbyes to two friends in 3 days. She has another memorial service tomorrow, today yet another. This one for her best friend of all.
They had a wonderful, wonderful marriage. Truly wonderful. They adored each other, and he was her best friend.
Joseph Shea was one of nearly 700 employees of Cantor Fitzgerald, killed when their offices more than 100 stories above Manhattan dissolved into rubble. But like the towers, for the Shea family, sorrow came in pairs. Joseph's younger brother, Daniel, also worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. He and his brother went to work side by side that Tuesday morning. Today they were remembered the very same way.
To my brothers, to my best friends, you will live in our hearts forever.
Sorrow found siblings on nearly every floor. The Egan sisters, Samantha on the left, Lisa on the right. Both worked at Cantor Fitzgerald too.
He's just one of 700.
Even the company's chairman lost his brother in the attack.
I have so many wives and husbands calling me. We are just driven to take care of them, and I can't think of anything else but taking care of them.
And with hundreds of funerals for the company still to come, the goodbyes have just begun.
It's endless, isn't it?
Yeah.
Today, Joe and Daniel were remembered for living life well, as businessmen, as fathers, as husbands, and as brothers. Lee Cowan, CBS News, New York.